What's up, everyone? Welcome back. This is episode 12 of Matt Talks Hemp. Thank you for tuning in. Somewhat of a shorter episode today. Not a ton of news the past week in the hemp and cannabis spaces, but there are a handful of notable headlines and events that I would like to point out to everyone. And just as a heads up, the content that I post on this channel is likely going to change a lot over the next couple weeks. I'm thinking of transitioning more to an interview style where I have on a guest that is an industry leader in some capacity in the hemp or cannabis space, or just has an interesting insight or experience in the space. It will be mostly in hemp and cannabis, but I might talk to someone who is into sustainable fashion or psychedelics or stuff like that, just other things that interest me. And so most likely by the end of April, I'll have the channel kind of converted over to facilitate those interviews, and I'll be doing those once a week most likely. And I think the beginning of the episode is still going to have like a news aggregate of the most notable headlines from the week. So I'm still going to do somewhat of a news show, but that's just going to be the first like 5 minutes of an hour or 2 hour long video. That's also a conversation with a specific guest that I have on that given week. But if you're here right now, I'm sure you're looking to just learn about the headlines from the past week. So let's dive into those. For the first segment today, we have an article headline, Feeding Cattle Hemp May Lower Their Stress Levels, according to a study. And so this study was recently published out of Kansas State University, and it shows that short-term feeding of industrial hemp with a high CBDA content increases lying behavior and reduces biomarkers of stress and inflammation in Holstein steers. It also showed that the cannabinoids did not accumulate in the blood, which means they will not linger in the meat from these animals, which is something important that the FDA would need to confirm before approving something like industrial hemp for animal feed, which if you've watched some of my past videos is kind of a sticky point with the FDA right now. And CBDA is essentially the raw form of CBD. It's an acidic form. And later on in this article, Michael Kleinhen's assistant professor of beef production medicine at Kansas State University said, cattle experience a variety of stressors and inflammation. Our most recent data shows how cannabinoids via industrial hemp decrease the stress hormone cortisol, as well as the specific inflammatory biomarker. So the FDA obviously is kind of dragging their feet when it comes to regulating hemp and hemp byproducts for animal feed. So I'm hoping that a study like this helps accelerate that process with the FDA. Moving on to the second segment, this is the only other article that we have about industrial hemp today. And the headline is IND Hemp and Hempitecture announce supply partnership for domestically produced hemp fiber nonwoven insulation. So if you've watched my hemp building materials video, you're obviously familiar with Hempitecture and their flagship product, hemp wool, essentially a fiber bat insulation made out of like 98% hemp fiber. And IND Hemp is one of the leading hemp processing facilities in the country right now. They're based in Montana. And so this partnership is to supply Hempitecture with the raw hemp fiber that they need to make their hemp wool insulation. And Hempitecture is currently building a manufacturing facility in Jerome, Idaho, to physically make the hemp wool insulation in Idaho. And this is great because IND Hemp is sourcing hemp fiber from the northwest part of the United States. So Hempitecture is going to be able to make their product, hemp wool, out of regionally grown hemp fiber, which I think is incredible. Moving on, we have a few different headlines from various different state regulatory updates on the adult use and medical cannabis side of things. And this first one is headlined, Governor Kristi Noem blocks automatic removal of old cannabis charges from background checks. So Kristi Noem is the governor of South Dakota, and this bill that she just vetoed would have automatically removed simple cannabis charges and convictions from public background records if a violation happened more than 5 years ago. Seems pretty harmless. If you had a simple possession conviction on your record and it was more than 5 years ago, it would be wiped from your record and probably make your life a lot easier in terms of getting a new job or getting an apartment and things like that. And so she says it also essentially codifies a convicted person's ability to be dishonest about their previous arrest and conviction by not requiring disclosure of the prior drug conviction. So that's one of the reasons why she said she vetoed it. But the majority of the politicians in South Dakota thought this was a good idea. They approved it and sent it to her desk. She vetoes it. And it apparently it only kind of had the slight majority. And now that she vetoed it, it would need 2/3 majority to overcome her veto. So I guess the The politician's Senator Mike Roll is the one who introduced this, and he doesn't anticipate having 2/3 support to override the governor's veto. So it doesn't look like this is going to end up becoming a law. For whatever reason, Kristi Noem is very anti-cannabis. She's very conservative. This is the same governor who her constituents voted for adult use cannabis back in 2020. And she started this whole legal battle to reverse it, basically, for a few different minor details of how the ballot was written, essentially. It was kind of crazy. I would think if you're a governor and your citizens vote for something, you'd want to support that, but who knows? So just kind of unfortunate development in South Dakota. Obviously not a great state to be in if you're trying to do anything with the plant, unfortunately. Moving on to a more positive topic, we have New Mexico commencing adult use sales as of April 1st. And this article is headlined, "Hundreds Line Up to Buy Legal Cannabis in New Mexico." And so apparently in Las Cruces, New Mexico, they did not set any hours of operation guidelines into the regulations. And so there were some stores in Las Cruces that said, hey, we're going to open up at midnight. If there's no guidelines around when we can open, we're opening up at midnight. And so this specific video, I'll just play it real quick, shows kind of a lot of people lining up. So this is like 400, 500 people lining up at midnight to get into this place. I guess the first person in line started standing in line at 6:30. And so I think most municipalities in New Mexico had kind of hours of operations built into the regulations, so they also didn't open up at midnight. I was kind of surprised when I saw that. But nonetheless, New Mexico shares a large border with Texas. Texas is very behind the times, I guess you could say, when it comes to cannabis regulation. So New Mexico is going to see a lot of Texas plates, I think, in their dispensary parking lots for the foreseeable future, because Texas doesn't seem like they're legalizing cannabis anytime soon. So if you're in New Mexico or if you're close by in northern Texas, now you have an easy way to go get some legal cannabis. Moving on to the next segment, we have a headline titled, "New Biden Budget Keeps Ban on DC Cannabis Sales but Preserves State Medical Cannabis Protections." So in 2014, the District of Columbia voted to legalize adult use cannabis. That was 8 years ago. There's still no regulated retail stores to buy cannabis in DC, because it's kind of this weird situation where they voted for adult use cannabis, but Congress has the final say on implementing it. So it's very different than how a typical state would vote and then roll out a legal cannabis market. And so Biden just submitted his budget proposal for the fiscal year 2023. And basically there's an aspect of this budget that prevents DC from using its local tax dollars to implement a system of legal adult use sales, even though the voters approved for it in 2014. So kind of a weird situation. I don't completely understand it, but it has created a very complex network of illicit sales in DC. Similarly to how we see pretty much every state that I've seen on the East Coast that votes in legal cannabis has this sort of problem with gifting. And I guess some people don't see it as a problem. Some people see it as an opportunity. But in terms of the regulatory bodies, they see this gifting situation as a problem, because all of a sudden one day cannabis is now legal for adult use, but there's no regulated stores to sell it. So people start gifting it. And it's happened in Massachusetts. It's happening right now in New Jersey, New York, Connecticut. And it's been happening in DC for the past 8 years. So DC has had 8 years to develop this like very extensive network of gifting companies. And so there's storefronts that are doing this. It's very prevalent. And there's actually a documentary in this next segment here. It's called Young, Gifting, and Black. So it basically just highlights the environment right now that is going on in DC with these cannabis operators, I guess you could call them, because there are still like medical operators who are licensed by the state, but then there's this whole network of non-licensed operators who, might not be getting their product tested. They don't have security. They don't have all these specific plans in place that regulated cannabis operations need, which I think is important. I think testing is very important for cannabis. You should not be buying any products that aren't tested. But just kind of a very weird dynamic right now going on in DC. So I just wanted to shed a little bit of a light on it. And if you're interested in this topic, just search Young, Gifting, and Black, and you'll be able to watch this documentary. moving on to the second to last segment of today's episode, we have the House passing the MORE Act. So this is easily the biggest headline from this past week. The House passed the MORE Act on Friday. A lot of the headlines, like this one from Reuters, says that the bill was to legalize cannabis. It's not to legalize cannabis. It's to decriminalize cannabis. So there's a lot of clickbaity titles and stuff, but it's not to legalize cannabis. This Reuters article I chose for a specific reason, which I'll get into in a second, but bill to legalize cannabis passes U.S. House but faces dim prospects in Senate. So I talked about this last week. I don't think this is going to get through the Senate because Chuck Schumer has his own bill that he's been talking about introducing soon. Why would he introduce this bill to be voted on the Senate floor if he has his own bill that he's interested in? So I just don't see this really going anywhere. But I wanted to use this article because if you're familiar with cannabis and you're watching this video and not just listening to it, this picture looks kind of weird. I don't know what's going on here. And so the headline is, or the description of the picture is, a fully budded marijuana plant is seen during the Cannadelic Miami Expo. This is very clearly not a real cannabis plant. So I just think it's kind of funny how whoever put this picture together, Marco Bello, very clearly is not familiar with cannabis at all. This is a fake cannabis plant. I saw this in a video for Highway Vodka, I think it was, making hemp seed vodka. And they used one of these plants, and I was very surprised at first. I was like, what is that? And then when I was at NOCO in Denver, I actually saw, it's like a company, Pot Plants, I think is the name of it, but they make replica cannabis plants. They tried to get as close as they could to making a replica flower, like the bud. And this is the closest they got. But as I am now, I was laughing when I first saw this. So I wanted to make sure I used this article. But regardless, everyone's all happy about the MORE Act passing the House. It's not going anywhere. Like this is not going to pass the Senate. Joe Biden's certainly not going to be signing anything. So don't get your hopes up. Sorry. For the last segment on today's episode, we have a topic that a lot of different news outlets picked up this past week. And the headline on this one from USA Today is, toxic air pollutants from smoking cannabis with a bong are 4 times worse than cigarettes, study finds. And so this study was published recently from the Journal of American Medical Association, which is a very reputable journal. And essentially it had a few people sit in a room and smoke a bong for like 2 hours. And so I don't know how they found those participants, but they probably got paid. So that was a nice gig for them, I guess. But it measures the particulate matter in the air before they started smoking, during their smoke session, and hours after the session, and continued to measure the particulate matter. No ventilation, no windows open, nothing like that. And so in that study, they reference an old study from cigarette smoke and the average particulate matter in a house that smokes cigarettes inside. I don't know the details of those other studies that they referenced, but in this specific one, there's different doctors that are quoted saying, you know, this is kind of one of the first controlled studies for cannabis smoke and things like that. And so I don't know what the ones for the tobacco smoke look like, but, you know, I would really like to see these very controlled, like do the same exact study side by side before we start saying that cannabis smoke is 4 times worse than cigarettes, because we're not really comparing apples to apples here. Obviously, secondhand smoke is bad. I don't think anyone would deny that. But to say specifically and come out and say cannabis is 4 times worse than cigarettes, like, I don't know. I think if these studies were done the exact same way, I would put my money on cigarettes being worse just because of all the other chemicals in them. Like, again, I'm not here saying that cannabis secondhand smoke is healthy for you or good for you in any way. Obviously, it's bad. Smoke in our lungs is bad. It's not good for you. This is kind of just super clickbaity, fear-mongery titles that I saw a lot of different news outlets pick up. So I just wanted to reference it. I will link the JAMA study in the description of the video. If you wanted to read the study yourself, you'll be able to. And that's episode 12. Thank you very much for sticking around and watching till the end. I appreciate you deeply. The people who watch this content, really do appreciate you. I thank you for your support. Any feedback, questions, comments, drop them in the comments, DM me, reach out on any social channels. Would love to interact with the people consuming this content. And like I said, a lot's going to be changing on this channel in the near future. So if you have any recommendations, suggestions, constructive criticism, I welcome it all. Again, thank you very much for tuning in. Until next week. See ya.